The bruise on my wrist matches the pattern of your cufflinks perfectly. Victoria's voice carried no tremor as she set the glass beside David's plate, her words floating across their breakfast table. The executive looked up from his phone, still scrolling through emails that would soon become irrelevant, his mind already planning another day of wielding power over everyone except the woman now serving him fresh squeezed orange juice. He barely glanced at her face. A mistake that would cost him everything. What are you talking about? David's tone held that familiar edge of dismissal, the same one he'd used last night when her questions about the offshore accounts had pushed him too far. The same edge that had preceded his hand around her throat, her back against their bedroom wall, his whispered threats about what happened to wives who forgot their place. But this morning something was different. Victoria moved with an almost ceremonial precision, arranging silverware, adjusting napkins, her silk robe flowing around her like she was performing a sacred ritual rather than serving breakfast. The morning light streaming through their windows caught the purple marks along her collarbone. Marks David had left 12 hours ago in a moment of rage he assumed she'd never dare discuss. I'm talking about evidence, she said softly, placing a perfectly prepared Eggs Benedict before him. Would you like to see? The question hung in the air as David's phone buzzed with what he assumed was another corporate crisis requiring his attention. He had no idea that downstairs in the lobby, 3 men in expensive suits were already asking the doorman for directions to his floor. He had no idea that his personal assistant had just received a call that would make her question everything she'd witnessed over the past 5 years. He had no idea that the woman across from him had just served him his last meal as a free man. Victoria sat down across from him, her own plate untouched, and folded her hands in her lap. For the first time in months she was smiling. David, she said, her voice carrying a strange musicality, do you remember what you told me last night about women who think they're clever? His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Something in her tone made the expensive breakfast taste wrong. Something in her eyes made his stomach clench with the first stirring of genuine fear he'd felt in years. You said we always reveal our plans too early. You said women can't help but show their hand. Victoria reached into her robe pocket and withdrew a small recording device, placing it gently beside the salt shaker. You were half right. The device showed 47 minutes and 32 seconds of recorded time from the night before. David's hand trembled as he set down his fork, the sound of metal against china echoing through their suddenly silent apartment. Outside, the city stretched endlessly below them, full of people going about their ordinary Thursday morning routines. People who had no idea they were about to witness the fall of one of the most powerful men in corporate America. The eggs are getting cold, Victoria observed pleasantly. You should eat. It's going to be a very long day. 3 floors below, elevator doors opened with a soft chime. What David didn't know yet was that this breakfast had nothing to do with forgiveness. It was about justice served ice cold. Victoria had learned patience the hard way. 8 years of marriage to David Brennan had taught her that survival required strategy, that freedom demanded perfect timing, and that the most dangerous moment in any plan was the moment your enemy realized they were already beaten. This morning, watching him cut into his eggs with hands that had hurt her just hours before, she finally understood what true power felt like. It felt like watching someone eat their last meal and not knowing it. I've been thinking about your presentation yesterday, Victoria said conversationally, buttering her toast with deliberate care. The one about hostile takeovers. You mentioned how the most successful acquisitions happen when the target never sees it coming. David's chewing slowed. His wife had never shown interest in his work before. A fact that had always pleased him. Women, in his experience, were meant to be beautiful accessories to successful men, not partners in understanding the complexities of corporate warfare. I particularly loved your quote about patience being the ultimate weapon, she continued. How did you put it? By the time your enemy realizes they're under attack, the war should already be over. The blood drained from David's face as his own words echoed back to him. Words he'd spoken to a room full of potential investors. Words that had secured him a $50 million acquisition deal. Words that his wife had apparently been listening to more carefully than anyone in that conference room. Victoria reached across the table and gently touched his hand. The same hand that had left marks on her skin. Her fingers traced the gold wedding band that had become more shackle than symbol, and for a moment her mask slipped just enough for him to see the steel underneath. The war is over, David, she whispered. You just don't know who won yet. The elevator timed again, closer now. Second floor. Victoria heard it through the walls of their apartment and felt a flutter of something that might have been nerves or might have been anticipation. David pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against polished wood. What the hell is this about, Victoria? What game are you playing? Game. The word almost made her laugh. Men like David always thought power was a game. Something with rules they could manipulate, boundaries they could stretch, opponents they could intimidate into surrender. They never understood that for people like her, power wasn't a game at all. It was survival. And survival didn't follow rules. Sit down, she said quietly. Please. Something in her tone made him pause. Not pleading, not demanding, just infinitely calm. This wasn't the woman who had cowered against their bedroom wall last night. This wasn't the woman who had learned to make herself small, to anticipate his moods, to absorb his anger. This was someone else entirely, someone who had been hiding underneath 8 years of carefully constructed submission. David was losing something fundamental. His certainty that he controlled this narrative. His absolute belief that he was the smartest person in any room. For 8 years he'd been the author of their story. Now someone else was holding the pen. You want to know what game I'm playing? Victoria stood and walked to the windows, her silhouette backlit by morning sun. I'm playing by your rules, David. The ones you taught me. She turned back to face him, and in the light he could see every mark he'd left on her skin. The bruises that formed a constellation of his cruelty. Rule number 1, she said, counting on her fingers like a professor delivering a lecture. Never let your opponent see your real strategy. Rule number 2. Always have more information than the other person thinks you do. Rule number 3. Wait until your enemy has no way out before you strike. David's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Then another. Then another. The sound seemed abnormally loud in the sudden tension of their breakfast room. You might want to answer those, Victoria suggested. I believe the first one is from your attorney. His hands shook as he grabbed the phone. 7 missed calls. 12 text messages. All from people who, until this morning, had considered him untouchable. The elevator timed a third time. Third floor. Victoria, David's voice cracked slightly. Whatever you think you're doing. I'm not thinking anymore, she interrupted. I'm done thinking. I've been thinking for 3 years, David. Every moment you weren't watching. Every time you assumed I was just another pretty face who married for money and status. She walked back to the table and sat down. David was losing his ability to predict what happened next. For a man who had built his fortune on anticipating market moves, the feeling was devastating. How long? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. How long what? How long have you been planning this? Victoria considered the question. Do you remember our first anniversary? You came home drunk from that client dinner and put your fist through our bathroom mirror because I'd asked about your late nights at the office. David's face went white. 3 years ago. I started recording you the next day, she continued conversationally. Not because I thought I'd ever be brave enough to use it. Just because I needed proof that it was really happening. The elevator timed a 4th time. 4th floor. They were coming. David bolted toward their home office, his mind racing through possibilities for damage control, evidence destruction, emergency protocols he'd developed for corporate crises but never imagined he'd need for personal ones. Victoria watched him go without moving from her chair, her expression serene. The files aren't there anymore, she called after him. I moved everything to a secure location 6 months ago. When he appeared in the doorway again, his face had transformed from confusion to rage to something approaching desperation. This was David stripped of his corporate armor, his social connections, his ability to intimidate and control. This was just a man who was finally facing consequences. What do you want? The question came out strangled. Victoria's laugh was soft and genuinely amused. David, you still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation. This is justice. She stood and walked to him. David was losing the thing that mattered most to him. Not money. Not status. Control. The absolute certainty that he could shape reality to his will. For 8 years, you taught me that power comes from information, timing, and the ability to destroy someone's life with a single decision. You were an excellent teacher. The elevator timed for the 5th time. Victoria moved to the front door, her hand resting on the handle. Through the peephole she could see 3 figures in expensive suits. She opened the door. "Mr. Brennan?" The lead investigator held up his badge. "We have some questions about several complaints filed against you. We'd like you to come with us." Victoria turned back to her husband, who stood frozen in the middle of their breakfast room. The morning light still streamed through their windows, but it illuminated a very different scene now. "You asked what I wanted," Victoria said. "I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be powerless. To have someone you trusted completely turn your own strengths against you." She walked back to David and stood close enough to whisper. "Last night when you had your hands around my throat, you told me I was nothing without you." Her smile was radiant. "You were wrong about that." The elevator doors were closing on David's old life, and opening on Victoria's new one. 3 years earlier, on their first anniversary, Victoria Brennan had always believed in the power of small gestures. Fresh flowers on Monday mornings. David's coffee exactly the way he liked it. Anniversary dinners planned months in advance because details mattered when you loved someone. Their first anniversary dinner was supposed to be perfect. She'd spent weeks coordinating with his assistant to find a night when his calendar was clear. Made reservations at the restaurant where they'd had their first date. Even bought a new dress, deep blue silk that made her feel like the woman David had fallen in love with rather than the careful, quiet person she'd somehow become over 12 months of marriage. But David came home 3 hours late, tie loosened, cologne mixed with something else. Something floral and expensive that wasn't hers. "Sorry, babe," he'd said, kissing her cheek with lips that tasted wrong. "Client dinner ran long. You know how it is." Victoria had nodded because she did know how it was. David's work came first. His clients were important. His deals were what paid for their beautiful apartment and her beautiful life. Later she would realize this was the first time he told the truth about what his work really involved. She'd smiled and suggested they order takeout instead, maybe open the bottle of champagne she'd been saving. Anniversary at home could be romantic too. That's when David had laughed. Not a happy laugh. A sound that made her stomach twist because she'd heard it before, directed at other people. Competitors who'd underestimated him. Business partners who'd made foolish assumptions. People David considered beneath his attention. "Anniversary," he'd repeated like the word amused him. "Right. Our anniversary." Victoria had felt something cold settle in her chest, but she'd kept smiling. "Our first anniversary. I thought we could celebrate." Celebrate what, exactly? The question had hung in the air between them. Victoria had stared at her husband, at the man who'd promised to love and cherish her, and realized she didn't recognize the look in his eyes. "Our marriage," she'd said quietly. "Us." David had walked to their bar cart and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch. Expensive scotch. The kind he only drank when he was celebrating a particularly ruthless business victory. "You want to know something about marriage, Victoria?" He'd taken a long sip, studying her over the rim of his glass. "It's just another acquisition. You identify a target. You determine what they're worth. You make an offer they can't refuse. And then you own them." In the present, Victoria watched through the apartment windows as David's phone continued buzzing in the investigator's hands. He still didn't know she'd recorded that conversation. He still didn't know it was already evidence. Victoria had felt the floor shift beneath her feet that night. "David, what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're a very beautiful asset," he'd continued, his voice carrying the same tone he used in boardrooms. "Clinical. Calculated. But assets don't get to make demands on my time. Assets don't schedule my calendar. And assets definitely don't expect me to pretend this is some romantic fairy tale." The words had hit her like physical blows. Victoria had stood in their living room, wearing her anniversary dress, holding champagne she'd bought to celebrate their love, and finally understood what her marriage actually was. A transaction. She didn't cry that night because crying in front of him would have been a mistake. "The flowers in your hair," David had said, gesturing vaguely toward her. "At our wedding. Do you remember what you said when you walked down the aisle?" Victoria remembered. She'd whispered that she'd never felt more beautiful, more chosen, more loved. "You said you felt like the luckiest woman in the world," David continued, "because someone like me had picked someone like you." He'd finished his scotch and set the glass down with deliberate care. "You were right about the lucky part. Just not the way you thought." That's when Victoria had made her first mistake. She'd asked questions. What about when you proposed? When you said you couldn't imagine life without me? David's expression had shifted into something that would later become familiar. Cold amusement mixed with irritation that she wasn't accepting her place gracefully. I said a lot of things. People say what's necessary to close the deal. Deal. Victoria's voice had cracked. David, I'm your wife. You're my wife because I wanted a wife. Beautiful. Well-educated. From a good family. Someone who would look perfect at corporate events and know when to speak and when not to. He'd moved closer and Victoria had caught that scent again. Someone else's perfume clinging to his shirt. Someone who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions about how I spend my time. Victoria had felt her world reshaping itself around this new reality. Every romantic gesture, every declaration of love, every moment she'd treasured as proof of their connection, recontextualized as manipulation. The other women, she'd whispered. David had smiled then. The same smile he'd given her during their vows. What other women? But Victoria had learned to read faces in her previous job. She'd worked in marketing before David convinced her she didn't need to work anymore. She'd been good at reading subtext, at understanding what people weren't saying. David's smile told her everything. How many? She'd asked. Does it matter? It matters to me. David had walked to their bathroom then, dismissing the conversation like he dismissed everything that didn't serve his interests. Victoria had followed, still hoping this was some terrible misunderstanding, still believing that the man she'd married existed somewhere underneath this stranger. She'd found him looking at himself in the mirror, adjusting his hair like he was preparing for another appointment. David, please. Talk to me. Help me understand. He'd turned to face her, and for a moment Victoria had seen something that might have been pity. You want to understand? He'd reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Here's what you need to understand. He'd shown her his call log. Names she didn't recognize. Numbers labeled with first names only. Call durations that told a story she didn't want to read. That call log would become Exhibit A in federal court. But one entry made her stomach drop completely. Claire Geneva, with a timestamp from that very afternoon. The same time David claimed to be in his client dinner. Business, he'd said simply. All business. Different kinds of business, but business nonetheless. Victoria had stared at the screen, at the evidence of her husband's other life, and felt something break inside her chest. Why are you showing me this? Because you asked, David had said. And because you need to learn when to stop asking. That's when Victoria had made her second mistake. She'd reached for his phone wanting to see more, needing to understand the scope of what she'd been blind to. David had grabbed her wrist. Not gently. Not like a husband protecting his privacy. Like a man asserting ownership over something that belonged to him. The gold cufflinks at his sleeves, engraved with his initials, caught the bathroom light as his fingers tightened around her arm. Don't, he'd said quietly. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. Victoria had looked down at his fingers wrapped around her arm, at the pressure that would leave marks, at the wedding ring that suddenly felt like evidence of something far darker than she'd ever imagined. You're hurting me. I'm teaching you. Victoria had tried to pull away, but David's grip had tightened. Teaching me what? Your place, he'd said simply. Our arrangement. The way this works. That's when Victoria had seen her reflection in their bathroom mirror. Her anniversary dress. Her carefully styled hair. Her face pale with shock and growing fear. And David behind her, holding her in place like she was a possession he was tired of explaining himself to. Let go of me. When you understand. Understand what? David's other hand had moved to her throat then. Not squeezing. Just resting there. A reminder of how easily he could control her breath, her words, her choices. Understand that this conversation is over, he'd said. Understand that we don't discuss my business. Understand that anniversaries and romantic dinners and all the things you think you're entitled to are privileges I grant you, not rights you possess. Victoria had stared at their reflection and seen the truth of her marriage for the first time. She wasn't David's partner. She wasn't his beloved wife. She was his most carefully managed property. And property, as he'd explained, didn't make demands. Now in the present, Victoria touched her wrist where those bruise patterns had formed. The investigators had photographed everything before David was taken away. Do you understand? He'd asked that night, his voice gentle now, almost loving. Victoria had nodded because her throat was too tight for words. Good girl, David had said, releasing her. I knew you were smart. He'd kissed her forehead then, the same way he had on their wedding day, and walked out of the bathroom like nothing had happened. Victoria had stood alone in front of their mirror, touching her wrist where his fingers had been, and made a decision that would take 3 years to fully execute. She was going to learn everything. Everything about David's business. Everything about his other women. Everything about the man she'd married and the life he'd built on lies. But first she needed to stop being someone who could be taught her place. She needed to become someone who could teach lessons of her own. The next morning, while David was at his office, Victoria had driven to a small electronics shop downtown. She'd paid cash for the smallest recording device they sold, asking specifically for something that could capture conversations through a door. She told herself it was just for protection. Just in case David's lessons became more violent. She'd had no idea she was taking the first step in a plan that would destroy everything he'd built. But she'd known even then that the woman who'd walked down the aisle believing in forever was gone. And whoever was taking her place was going to be much more dangerous. Victoria stood in their empty apartment now, watching through the windows as David was led to a dark sedan waiting at the curb. The investigators had been professional, almost gentle. They'd given him time to dress properly, to call his attorney, to maintain some dignity even as his world collapsed. More mercy than he'd ever shown her. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. It's done. Press conference at 2 p.m. Are you ready? Victoria looked around the apartment one last time. At the breakfast table where David had eaten his last meal as a free man. At the windows where she'd stood planning his destruction. At the space that had been her prison and was now her launching pad. Ready? She'd been ready for 3 years. She typed back, on my way. But first there was one more call to make. One more call to the woman whose perfume she'd smelled that first night. The woman who had no idea she was about to become the star witness in a federal case. Victoria's lawyer met her in the underground garage of a downtown hotel, away from the cameras that had already begun gathering outside the federal courthouse. Adrian Voss stepped out of a silver sedan, his movements precise and controlled in the way that marked him as someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. She'd chosen him specifically because he wasn't part of David's world. No shared connections, no corporate loyalties that could be leveraged. Just a reputation for destroying powerful men who thought they were untouchable. Mrs. Brennan. He extended his hand, and Victoria noticed the calluses that suggested he hadn't always worked behind a desk. Are you ready for this? Victoria shook his hand, surprised by the steadiness of her own grip. I've been ready for 3 years. Adrian studied her face in the dim garage lighting. Ready for the arrest, yes. But what comes next is different. Once we walk into that press conference, there's no going back to being David Brennan's quiet wife. You understand that? Something in his tone made Victoria pause. What aren't you telling me? David's attorney called an hour ago, Adrian said. They want to make a deal. Victoria felt her stomach drop. What kind of deal? Full confession in exchange for reduced charges. He'll admit to the financial crimes, the tax evasion, even the offshore accounts. But he wants immunity on the domestic charges. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. You should have minded your own business. She stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly as adrenaline hit her system. Adrian. He looked at her phone and his expression hardened immediately. How did they get this number? I changed it yesterday. Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands were starting to shake. Adrian scanned the garage, suddenly alert in a way that made Victoria realize how exposed they were. We need to discuss this quickly. Victoria, David's people already know where you are. No. The word came out sharper than Victoria intended. No deals. Absolutely not. Adrian nodded like he'd expected that response. I told them that. But Victoria, you need to understand what saying no means. David's legal team isn't going to go quietly. They're going to attack your credibility, your motives, your evidence. And now someone else is watching. Victoria looked around the empty garage, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. If she went forward, there would be no quiet version of her life left. Ever. Let them try. It's not just about what they'll say in court, Adrian continued. David's business associates, his investors, the people who have money tied up in his deals. They're going to lose everything because of your evidence. Some of them won't take that quietly. A chill ran down Victoria's spine. Are you saying I'm in danger? I'm saying you were safer when you were just David's wife, Adrian said quietly. Now you're the woman who brought down a $50 million financial empire. That makes you a target. Victoria thought about her apartment, about the life she'd been planning to build after David was gone. The freedom she'd spent 3 years working towards suddenly felt much more complicated. So what do you recommend? Adrian moved closer, lowering his voice. We could accept a modified version of the deal. David pleads guilty to everything, serves serious time, but you don't have to testify publicly. Your identity stays protected. You disappear quietly and start over somewhere safe. Victoria stared at him. You want me to let him win? I want you to understand your options while you still have them. The words hung between them in the concrete silence of the garage. Victoria realized that Adrian wasn't just her lawyer anymore. He was the first person in years who seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being rather than what she could do for them. What would you do? She asked. If it were someone you cared about? Adrian's expression shifted, becoming more personal than professional. I'd want them to be smart. But I'd also understand if they couldn't walk away from a fight this important. Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Trust. Not the careful, calculated trust she'd learned to ration during her marriage, but the real thing. Dangerous and necessary and absolutely terrifying. There's something else, Adrian said. The woman from Geneva. Claire Dubois. She wants to meet with you. Victoria's breath caught. She knows about the case? She called my office this morning after she saw David's arrest on the news. Victoria, she says David wasn't just having an affair with her. She says he was using her to launder money through her family's Swiss bank. The garage suddenly felt much smaller. Victoria realized that her carefully planned revenge had uncovered something much larger and more dangerous than her husband's cruelty. How many people are involved in this? We don't know yet, Adrian said. But Claire thinks David was just the American connection in a much bigger network. International money laundering, tax evasion, possibly worse. If she's right, you didn't just bring down one man. You exposed an entire operation. Adrian's phone rang. He answered quickly, his expression growing darker as he listened. When? He said into the phone. How many? Pause. No, keep her away from there. We're coming to you. He hung up and turned to Victoria. Claire Dubois was attacked an hour ago outside her hotel. 2 men. Professional job. She's alive but barely. Victoria's legs felt weak. Because of me. Because I dragged her into this. Because David's people know she's talking, Adrian corrected. Victoria, this isn't your fault, but it is your reality now. These people tried to kill a witness. They won't hesitate to come after you. Victoria thought about the woman whose perfume she'd smelled that first night. A woman who had been just as much David's victim as she was, but who was now fighting for her life because Victoria had exposed the truth. Where is she? Safe house. Federal protection. But Victoria, if you're going to meet with her, if you're going to see this through, you need to decide right now. Because once you hear what she knows, once you become a witness to whatever David was really doing, there's no going back. Victoria looked at Adrian, at this man who was offering her information that would change everything. She thought about the woman in the safe house, about the other victims who might be scattered across David's business empire, about the 3 years she'd spent learning to be someone who couldn't be taught her place. The choice wasn't really between safety and danger anymore. The choice was between running from a truth that was already destroying people or facing it completely. I need to see her, Victoria said. I need to know what I've gotten into. Adrian nodded, but Victoria caught something in his expression. Not relief exactly. Recognition. Then we see this through, he said. But Victoria, once we walk through that safe house door, everything changes. Your marriage was just the beginning of this story. As they drove through the city toward an address Adrian wouldn't tell her until they were in the car, Victoria realized that the breakfast she'd served David that morning had been the end of one war and the beginning of another. And this time she had no idea who all the enemies were. Victoria's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Claire was just the warning. Stop now or you're next. Adrian saw the message and pressed harder on the accelerator. Victoria, he said quietly, I need you to know something. What we're walking into isn't just a legal case anymore. It's a network that's been operating for years and they've killed to protect it before. Victoria looked at him, at the concentration on his face as he navigated through traffic, at the way he kept checking the mirrors like he expected to be followed. "And you're still helping me?" Adrian glanced at her, and Victoria saw something that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Someone has to make sure the truth comes out," he said. "Even when it's dangerous." Victoria realized that somewhere between the garage and this moment, between the terror and the determination, she'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She was going to see this through, whether she survived it or not. The safe house was a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that looked ordinary enough to be invisible. Adrian led Victoria through a side entrance where a federal agent waited with the kind of alert stillness that suggested extensive training in controlled violence. "Agent Torres," Adrian nodded to the woman. "How is she?" "Conscious. Agree. And asking for Mrs. Brennan specifically," Torres replied, scanning the street behind them before closing the door. "But I need to warn you both. We've had 3 suspicious vehicles circle this block in the last hour." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "They followed us here? Maybe. Or they're tracking cell phones. Or they have someone inside the federal system." Torres locked 3 separate deadbolts behind them. "Point is, nowhere is safe anymore." The house felt cramped, overfilled with surveillance equipment and tension. Victoria could hear voices from upstairs, urgent and professional. The kind of voices that discussed people's lives in terms of acceptable losses. Adrian touched her elbow gently. "You can still change your mind." Victoria looked at him, at the concern in his eyes that felt increasingly personal. "Could you? If it were your choice." "No," he said simply. "But I'm not the one whose photo is about to be on every news station in the country." Agent Torres led them upstairs to a bedroom that had been converted into a makeshift medical facility. Claire Dubois sat propped against pillows, her face a map of bruises, her left arm in a sling. But her eyes were sharp and focused in a way that reminded Victoria painfully of herself. "You're the wife," Claire said without preamble. Her accent was faint but unmistakable. "The one who brought him down." Victoria stepped closer to the bed. "I'm the one who recorded him. I'm sorry you got hurt because of it." Claire's laugh was bitter. "I got hurt because I was naive. Because I believed David when he said his wife didn't understand business. Because I thought love and money could exist in the same space without one destroying the other." Victoria felt something twist in her chest. The recognition of shared experience, shared mistakes. "How long?" Victoria asked. 2 years. He told me you were distant. That your marriage was a formality for his business reputation." Claire touched her bruised face carefully. "I should have known that men who lie to their wives lie to everyone." Adrian moved to the window, checking the street below. "Claire, we need you to tell Victoria what you told the federal agents. About the money." Claire's expression hardened. "David wasn't just laundering money through my family's bank. He was using it to fund something much worse." Victoria sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Worse how?" "I think weapons sales. International buyers. The money from his corporate deals was just the clean front, but I only saw pieces. David was careful about what he told me." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her again. Every answer seemed to reveal 10 new questions. "How many people?" Victoria asked. "I don't know. David always said he had protection. Someone he called architect." Claire's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "David always said architect could make warrants appear or disappear. Could make problems go away." Adrian's phone buzzed. He checked it and his expression went white. "We need to move. Now." "What happened?" Torres demanded. "David's lawyer just filed an emergency motion claiming Victoria stole classified business documents. They're asking for federal marshals to arrest her immediately." Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. "They can do that?" "If a federal judge signs the warrant, yes," Adrian said grimly. "And David's legal team knows which judges owe him favors." Torres was already reaching for her radio, but she hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the device. Something in her expression made Victoria's stomach clench. "Torres," Adrian said. "Are you calling this in?" Torres's jaw tightened. "This is Torres. We need immediate extraction for the witness." "Yes, both witnesses." But Victoria caught something in Torres's voice. A note that didn't quite match her words. Claire grabbed Victoria's hand with surprising strength. There's something else. Something I didn't tell the agents yet. Victoria leaned closer. What? There's a safety deposit box. Bank of International Commerce, downtown. Box 847. David doesn't know I know about it. Whatever architect is hiding, it might be in there. Adrian stopped moving. How do you know about it? Claire's eyes flicked toward Torres, then back to Victoria. David took me there once. Said he needed a witness for something legitimate. But I saw other boxes. Files. Things that didn't match his story. Torres's radio crackled. Torres, abort the extraction. Federal marshals are en route to your location with arrest warrants. Adrian grabbed Victoria's arm. Back exit. Now. Wait, Claire called after them. Victoria, whatever's in that box, David was afraid of it. More afraid than I'd ever seen him. Torres was pushing them toward the stairs. My orders are to protect Claire, not you two. If you're going to run, go now. Victoria looked back at Claire, at this woman who had been brave enough to speak up despite nearly being killed for it. Why are you helping me? Because David told me you were weak, Claire said. And I want him to be wrong about something. Adrian pulled Victoria down the stairs as the sound of vehicles approached outside. Through the front windows she could see black SUVs parking at both ends of the street. Kitchen, Torres hissed. Through the garden. There's a fence you can climb. Adrian's phone rang. He answered while guiding Victoria toward the back door. What? His face went pale. When? Boss. How much do they know? He hung up and turned to Victoria. Your apartment building. Federal agents are searching it right now. They're claiming national security concerns. Victoria felt everything she'd built crumbling around her. What does that mean? It means once they report you fled, the narrative flips completely, Adrian said grimly. You'll be the criminal and David will be the victim. They reached the back door as Torres appeared behind them. I can give you 5 minutes before I have to report you left. After that, you're on your own. Victoria looked at Adrian, at this man who could have walked away from her case a dozen times but who was instead about to become a target with her. You don't have to do this, she said. This isn't your fight. Adrian's eyes met hers, and Victoria saw something that made her heart race despite the terror of their situation. It became my fight when I realized what was really at stake, he said quietly. When I understood the system was compromised. Victoria felt something shift between them. Something that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with the fact that they were about to disappear together into a world where trust was the only currency that mattered. The safety deposit box, Victoria said. We need to get there before they freeze all the accounts. Victoria, if we go after that box, we're not just running from the law. We're actively fighting it. There's no going back from that. Through the window, Victoria could see federal agents surrounding the building. In a few minutes, they would breach the doors and discover she was gone. The hunt would begin. She thought about David, probably sitting in federal custody believing his connections would save him. She thought about Claire, willing to risk her life for the truth. She thought about whatever was so dangerous that David feared it more than exposure. Then we don't go back, Victoria said. We go forward. Adrian squeezed her hand once, and Victoria realized that somewhere in the space of a few hours, she'd stopped seeing him as just her lawyer and started seeing him as something much more dangerous and necessary. A partner. Torres opened the back door. Clock starts now. 5 minutes. Victoria and Adrian stepped into the garden as the first federal agents reached the front door. Behind them, their old lives ended. Ahead of them, something entirely new was beginning. The Bank of International Commerce sat on a corner in the financial district like a fortress built of glass and steel. Victoria and Adrian approached it separately, meeting in the polished lobby where security cameras tracked every movement and armed guards stood at careful attention. Victoria's hands were steady as she approached the teller, but her heart was racing. 6 hours ago, she'd been serving breakfast to her husband. Now she was about to access a safety deposit box that might contain evidence of international crimes. Box 847, she told the teller, sliding across the identification Claire had given her. I'm listed as an authorized user. The teller's fingers moved across her computer keyboard with practiced efficiency, but Victoria caught the slight frown that crossed her face. Miss Dubois, there's been unusual activity on this account today. Several inquiries from different parties. Victoria felt ice in her veins. What kind of inquiries? I'm not authorized to discuss details, but I can tell you that you're the fourth person to ask about this box since this morning. Adrian appeared at Victoria's elbow. Is there a problem? The teller looked between them. Are you both authorized users? Victoria thought quickly. He's my attorney. I'm here to gather documents for legal proceedings. After what felt like an eternity, the teller nodded. Follow me. They were led through a maze of corridors to the vault level, where rows of safety deposit boxes lined the walls like secrets waiting to be unlocked. The teller used her key and waited for Victoria to use Claire's key before sliding the long metal box from its slot. You have privacy room 3, the teller said. Take your time. The moment the door closed behind them, Victoria and Adrian opened the box. Inside were documents that made Victoria's blood run cold. Bank transfer records showing millions of dollars moving between accounts she'd never heard of. Purchase orders for equipment that was clearly military grade. And photographs. Dozens of photographs. Victoria lifted the first one with trembling hands. David at a dinner party, shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize. The second photo showed the same man at what looked like an official government function. The third photo made Victoria's knees buckle. Agent Torres, the woman who had just helped them escape federal custody. Sitting across from David at an intimate restaurant, their hands intertwined on the table. Adrian, Victoria whispered. Look at this. Adrian took the photograph and Victoria watched his face go white. When was this taken? Victoria checked the date stamp. 6 months ago. More photographs. Torres at David's office building. Torres getting into David's car. Torres and David together at what looked like a private airport, standing next to a plane with foreign markings. She's not a federal agent, Victoria said, the realization hitting her like cold water. Or she is, but she's working for David. Adrian was rifling through more documents. Victoria, look at this. He held up a typed memo with official federal letterhead. Orders to place you under surveillance. Signed by Torres. Dated 3 weeks ago. Victoria felt the room spinning. 3 weeks ago. Before I made my move against David. Before anyone knew what I was planning. They knew, Adrian said grimly. Somehow they knew you were gathering evidence. Victoria thought back to the safe house, to Torres's hesitation before calling for backup, to the way she'd insisted they had only 5 minutes to escape. She let us get away, Victoria realized. She wanted us to come here. Adrian was already moving toward the door. It's a trap. But when Adrian turned the handle, the door didn't open. They were locked in. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thank you for leading us to the evidence. We'll be right down. Victoria looked at Adrian, and for the first time since this began, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. How did they know we were here? Victoria asked. Adrian's jaw tightened. Because they've been tracking me. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. What? Victoria, I should have told you. After David was arrested, Torres contacted me. She said there were national security implications, that I needed to report if you tried to access certain locations or accounts. Adrian's voice was breaking. I thought I was helping a legitimate investigation. Victoria felt her world shifting again. You've been reporting on me. Limited information. Logistics only. I never told them about your evidence or your plans. Adrian moved closer. Victoria, please listen to me. I started cooperating because I thought I was protecting you. But when I realized Torres wasn't really federal, when I saw how they were hunting you, Victoria backed away from him, pressing herself against the wall of the small room. How do I know what you told them and what you didn't? Because I'm here with you instead of safe at home, Adrian said desperately. Because I chose to become a target rather than keep feeding them information. Victoria stared at the man she'd trusted, trying to separate truth from manipulation in a world where both seemed equally dangerous. When did you realize Torres wasn't legitimate? She asked. This morning. When she hesitated before calling for backup. When I saw the way she looked at you. Adrian's hands reached toward her, then stopped. Victoria, I know you have no reason to trust me. But I need you to know that everything I felt, everything between us, that was real. Victoria wanted to believe him. Every instinct she'd developed told her that Adrian's emotion was genuine. But every instinct she'd had about people had been wrong before. How do I know you're not lying right now? She asked. How do I know this isn't just another layer of the plan? Before Adrian could answer, they heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots. Multiple people. Adrian moved closer to Victoria, close enough that she could see the desperation in his eyes. Victoria, I know you have no reason to trust me. But in about 30 seconds Torres and her people are going to come through that door. And when they do, our only chance is to work together. Victoria looked into Adrian's eyes, searching for truth in a situation where truth had become impossible to distinguish from deception. The documents, she said suddenly. If they wanted the evidence, why let us find it first? Adrian's eyes widened. Because they needed to know what Claire told you. They needed to know how much you'd figured out. Which means the real evidence isn't here, Victoria realized. This is just what they wanted us to find. The footsteps stopped outside their door. Victoria made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. She moved closer to Adrian, close enough to feel his breath, close enough to see the genuine fear and regret in his eyes. If we're doing this, she whispered, if we're really fighting them together, I need to know one thing. Anything. When you chose to stop reporting to them, was it because of the case or because of me? Adrian's hands almost reached for her face, then stopped as if he were holding himself back from crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Victoria, you became the only thing that mattered. The confession hung between them, raw and unresolved, as the door handle began to turn. But instead of Torres, David Brennan walked into the room. Still in his expensive suit. Still perfectly groomed. Still carrying himself like a man who owned the world. And smiling like he'd been expecting them all along. Hello, darling, he said to Victoria. Did you really think it would be that easy? David stepped fully into the small vault room, and Victoria noticed he wasn't alone. Two men in suits flanked him, their hands resting casually near concealed weapons. The easy confidence in David's posture told Victoria everything she needed to know about who was really in control. You look surprised, darling, David said, adjusting his cufflinks with the same casual precision she'd watched him use every morning for 8 years. Surely you didn't think a few recordings and some financial documents would be enough to destroy me. Victoria's voice came out steadier than she felt. You're supposed to be in federal custody. David's laugh was the same sound that had haunted her nightmares. Federal custody. Yes, that was an interesting performance, wasn't it? Very convincing. Agent Torres deserves credit for her acting skills. The room felt smaller, airless. Victoria realized that every moment of the last 24 hours had been choreographed, every choice she'd made had been anticipated. The arrest was fake, she whispered. The arrest was theater, David corrected. Designed to make you feel powerful. To make you believe you'd won. He moved closer and Victoria instinctively stepped back. You always were too trusting, Victoria. It made you easy to predict. Adrian moved protectively closer to Victoria. You can't just walk in here. This is a federal. Mr. Voss, David interrupted pleasantly. Thank you for your assistance in this matter. Your services are no longer required. Victoria watched Adrian's face go white. What is he talking about? David smiled. Adrian didn't tell you everything, did he? You think you know when he stopped helping us, but you don't know how useful his cooperation really was. That's not true, Adrian said desperately. Victoria, I told you what happened. You told her what you wanted her to believe, David said conversationally. But we both know there's more to the story, don't we, Adrian? Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her feet again. What is he talking about? David's tone was almost gentle. Adrian has been more helpful than he's admitted. Haven't you, counselor? Victoria looked at Adrian, searching his face for denial, for proof that David was manipulating the truth. Instead she saw something that looked like trapped desperation. Victoria, Adrian said quietly, it's not what he's making it sound like. The words hit her like cold water. Not a denial. An excuse. How much? Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. More than he told you, David answered. Less than he could have done. Adrian was caught between loyalty to you and other considerations. Victoria turned to Adrian and she saw the guilt written across his face. What other considerations? Adrian's hands reached toward her, then stopped. Victoria, everything I felt for you was real. But David is right. I didn't tell you everything about what they asked me to do. Victoria felt her world tilting again. What didn't you tell me? The recordings, Adrian said barely above a whisper. They didn't just want me to report where you went. They wanted me to record our conversations. David nodded approvingly. Adrian's been very thorough. Every private moment, every confession, every time you trusted him with your fears or your plans. David's smile was sharp. Audio quality is excellent, by the way. Victoria realized that even this conversation was being recorded. That David would have audio of her breakdown, her desperation, her moment of believing Adrian cared about her. But here's what's interesting, David continued. Adrian could have given us much more. Location data from your phone. Access to your evidence files. Real-time updates on your plans. David glanced at Adrian with something that might have been respect. But he didn't. Which makes me think he developed some inconvenient feelings along the way. Victoria looked between David and Adrian, trying to understand what was truth and what was manipulation. So what's real? That's the beauty of it, David said. You'll never know for sure. Was Adrian's concern genuine, or was he just playing his role very well? Did he limit his cooperation because he cared about you, or because he was smart enough to keep his options open? David shrugged. Even Adrian probably doesn't know anymore. Victoria felt something breaking inside her chest. Not just her heart but her ability to trust her own judgment. Every moment of connection, every shared look, every time she'd felt understood, was now contaminated with doubt. What do you want, David? I want you to understand your position, David said. You have two choices. You can walk away quietly with a comfortable future and the knowledge that no one else gets hurt. Or you can keep fighting a war you can't win. Victoria's mind raced. And if I walk away? Then Claire's death becomes a tragic but isolated incident. Adrian continues his practice with a very generous retainer. His daughter grows up safe. Your sister continues teaching her kindergarten class without incident. Victoria noticed that David didn't make absolute promises. He spoke in probabilities and likelihoods, which meant his control wasn't as complete as he wanted her to believe. And if I don't walk away? David's expression hardened slightly. Then things become much more complicated for everyone involved. As if on cue, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smiled, but Victoria caught a flicker of something in his expression. Irritation maybe. Or concern. Ah, David said. It seems there are some unexpected developments I need to address. He looked at Victoria with renewed focus. Which means your timeline just got shorter. Victoria realized that David's confident facade was hiding something. Problems he hadn't anticipated. Complications in his perfect plan. What kind of developments? David's smile became forced. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. Just some loose ends that require attention. Victoria felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Hope. David's empire wasn't as secure as he wanted her to believe. Now, David continued, but his tone had lost some of its earlier ease. I need to know which option you're choosing. Because there may be other people whose safety depends on your decision. David showed Victoria his phone screen. A photograph of Adrian's daughter at a playground. A little girl with pigtails and a bright smile, completely unaware that she was being watched. Adrian made a strangled sound. You said you'd leave her alone. I said I'd try to avoid unpleasant necessities, David corrected. But circumstances change. Victoria watched Adrian realize that his daughter's safety was conditional, not guaranteed. That David's threats were leverage, not certainty. There's also the matter of your sister, Victoria, David continued. Sarah, isn't it? The one who teaches in Portland? Lovely woman. Victoria felt her fighting spirit drain away, but she also noticed that David didn't seem to know as much about Sarah as he pretended. His information felt general, gathered quickly rather than through long surveillance. David was powerful but he wasn't omniscient. You have until midnight, David said. After that, things become much more difficult to control. The phrasing was telling. Not that he would take action but that control would become difficult. Which meant his power had limits. David turned to leave then paused. Oh, and Victoria? Just so we're clear about the recording situation. Adrian, show her the device. Adrian's face went white, but he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. Victoria felt the final violation land. Even their private moments in this room had been captured for David's use. "You have good instincts, darling," David said to Victoria. "You just need to learn when to trust them." David and his men left, but the vault door remained locked. Victoria and Adrian were alone again, but the silence between them felt like a minefield. "Victoria," Adrian said quietly, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that what I felt for you was real, even when what I was doing was wrong." Victoria looked at him, at this man who had been both her ally and her betrayer. "How do I know what's real anymore, Adrian? How do I tell the difference between what you chose and what you were forced to do?" Adrian had no answer that would satisfy either of them. Because in David's world, the line between choice and coercion blurred until even the people living it couldn't see clearly. Victoria sat down on the floor of the vault, surrounded by evidence that had cost Claire her life and accomplished nothing visible. In 10 hours she would have to choose between her principles and the safety of people she cared about. But she'd also seen cracks in David's control. Seen uncertainty behind his confidence. For the first time since this began, she had no clear plan. No obvious strategy. But she wasn't ready to surrender yet. Victoria sat in the locked vault room for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall showed only 20 minutes had passed since David left. Adrian remained silent across from her, the recording device between them like a physical representation of every lie that had shaped their relationship. But in the silence, Victoria's mind was working. David had made mistakes. Small ones, but mistakes nonetheless. He'd seemed irritated by something on his phone. He'd spoken in probabilities rather than certainties. He'd needed to leave suddenly to handle unexpected developments. Most importantly, he'd locked her in a bank vault with his evidence. Victoria stood up and began examining the documents more carefully. Not just the photographs and financial records, but the details hidden in the margins. Bank routing numbers. Transfer dates. Account signatures. "What are you looking for?" Adrian asked. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She was studying a particular transfer record, one that showed money moving from David's primary account to an account labeled Emergency Protocol. "Adrian," she said carefully, "when you were recording our conversations, did David ever specify what he wanted you to listen for?" Adrian shifted uncomfortably. "He wanted to know if you'd figured out the scope of his operations. Whether you knew about the international connections. But not the financial structure? No. He seemed confident you couldn't understand the money trail." Adrian paused. "Why?" Victoria held up the transfer record. "Because David made an assumption about me that was wrong. He assumed I was still the naive wife who didn't understand business. But I've had 3 years to learn." She pointed to the account number. "This account. Emergency Protocol. It's not in David's name. It's not in any of his business names. But look at the signature card." Adrian moved closer to look. "That's not David's signature. No. It's Torres's. But here's what's interesting." Victoria pulled out another document. "This account has been receiving transfers for 2 years. But Torres supposedly only started investigating David after his arrest yesterday." Adrian's eyes widened as he understood. Torres wasn't working for David. Or they were working together, but not the way we thought, Victoria said. David thought he was untouchable because Torres was protecting him. But what if Torres was using him? Victoria's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Pier 47, 1 hour. Come alone. No lawyers. No backup. Final offer. Victoria showed Adrian the message. That's not David's writing style. Before Adrian could respond, the vault door opened. Agent Torres stood in the doorway. Alone. And she looked nothing like the composed federal agent Victoria had met at the safe house. Torres's hair was disheveled, her suit was wrinkled, and there was blood on her sleeve. "Mrs. Brennan," Torres said. "We need to talk." Adrian stepped protectively closer to Victoria. "We're not going anywhere with you." Torres laughed, but there was something wild in it. "You think you have a choice? You think any of us have choices at this point?" She stepped into the vault and closed the door behind her. Victoria noticed Torres's hands were shaking, and there was something in her eyes that looked like fear. "What happened to you?" Victoria asked. "David happened," Torres said. "David and his friends happened." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing deep bruises around her wrist. "Turns out I was more expendable than I thought." Torres pulled out her phone and showed Victoria a text message. Package delivered. Clean up remaining loose ends. You know what to do. David sent this 30 minutes ago, Torres said. Right after he left you. Victoria stared at the message. Package delivered? Torres's expression went dark. That's what we called assignments. Completed assignments. Victoria felt ice in her veins. Claire. Among other things, Torres said quietly. But here's what David doesn't know. I kept copies. Difference. Bank records, communication logs, video files. Everything. Adrian was watching Torres carefully. So what do you want from us? Torres met Victoria's eyes. I want to make a trade. My evidence for your protection. We both disappear and David's operation burns to the ground. Victoria felt the trap closing around her. What kind of protection? David's people are coming for both of us tonight. The peer meeting? It's not a negotiation. It's an elimination. Torres's voice was steady now, but Victoria caught the edge of desperation. But if we work together, if we move fast, we can hit them first. Adrian moved closer to Victoria. It could be another trap. It could be, Victoria agreed. But what choice do we have? Torres pulled a flash drive from her pocket. This contains everything. Financial records, communication intercepts, documentation of weapons transfers. But I need something from you first. Victoria felt her stomach drop. What? Your recording device. The one with David's confession from last night. I need it to authenticate my files, to prove the timeline matches. Torres's voice hardened. But once you give it to me, you lose your only independent evidence. You'll have to trust that I'm telling the truth about what's on this drive. Victoria stared at the flash drive. Her recording was the only proof she had that wasn't filtered through Torres. Once she gave it up, she would be completely dependent on the word of a woman who had already admitted to killing people. And if I don't give it to you? Torres shrugged. Then you go to the peer meeting alone tonight. You face David and his people with no backup, no evidence they don't already know about, and no way to protect anyone you care about. Victoria looked at Adrian. She's asking me to choose between certainty and survival. It's worse than that, Adrian said quietly. She's asking you to choose between fighting David with her evidence or facing him with nothing. Torres checked her phone. You have 10 minutes to decide. After that, I disappear and you're on your own. Victoria realized the impossible nature of her choice. Give Torres the recording and lose her independence, potentially trusting a killer with everything. Or keep the recording and face David's network with no allies and no strategic advantage. There's something else, Torres said. If you choose to work with me, Adrian can't come. David's people know his face now. His presence would compromise the operation. Victoria felt her heart sink. That's not negotiable. It's not negotiable for me either, Torres said. Adrian stays behind or the deal is off. Victoria turned to Adrian, seeing the conflict in his eyes. The knowledge that staying with her might get them both killed, but leaving her might cost her life. Victoria, Adrian said quietly, if this is our only chance to stop David, you have to take it. Even if it means what? Adrian's voice was barely a whisper. Even if it means I can't protect you anymore. Victoria felt the true cost of the choice settling over her. Not just giving up her evidence, but giving up the one person who had chosen to stand with her, flawed as that choice had been. Torres was already moving toward the door. 5 minutes, Mrs. Brennan. Choose. Victoria looked at the recording device in her hands. 3 years of planning. Her proof of David's cruelty. Her evidence of his crimes. Her only independent weapon. She looked at Adrian. The man who had betrayed her and chosen her, who had lied to her and fought for her, who might be her last chance at love or her final mistake. She looked at Torres. A killer offering salvation, a liar promising truth, an enemy proposing alliance. Victoria realized that there was no choice that didn't cost her something irreplaceable. No path that didn't require her to sacrifice something essential. She held out the recording device to Torres. Take it, she said. And if you betray me, if this is just another level of David's game, I'll make sure your name is in every headline when this story breaks. Torres took the device and Victoria felt her last piece of independent power slip away. Adrian, Victoria said without turning around. I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to stay alive. No matter what happens tonight, no matter what you hear or what anyone tells you happened to me, I need you to survive this. Victoria's voice was steady, but Adrian could hear the goodbye in it. Because someone has to remember what really happened here. Victoria followed Torres toward the door, leaving behind the man who loved her and the evidence that could have saved her. She was walking into the darkness with nothing but the word of a killer and the hope that sometimes, the only way to defeat a monster was to trust one. The drive to Pier 47 took place in tense silence. Torres drove with the focused intensity of someone racing against time, while Victoria sat in the passenger seat watching the city lights blur past and wondering if she'd just made the last decision of her life. Tell me about the flash drive, Victoria said as they neared the waterfront. Bank records going back 3 years. Communication logs between David and international buyers. Video evidence of weapons transfers. Torres's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Everything needed to destroy the entire network. And David doesn't know you have it? Torres was quiet for a moment too long. David knows someone has been copying files. He doesn't know it was me. Something in Torres's tone made Victoria's stomach tighten. What aren't you telling me? Before Torres could answer, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her face went white. Don't answer it, Victoria said quickly. But Torres was already swiping to accept. Yes. Victoria could hear the voice on the other end tinny through the speaker. Mail. Come. Familiar. Agent Torres. I trust you're following instructions. David. Torres met Victoria's eyes in the rearview mirror. Everything is proceeding as planned. Excellent. And Mrs. Brennan. Victoria felt ice run down her spine as she realized Torres was still taking orders from David. She gave me the recording device. She trusts me completely. David's laugh was warm, almost fond. Of course she does. Bring her to the pier, Carmen. Let's finish this. The call ended. Victoria stared at Torres, feeling the last piece of her world crumble. Carmen. My real name, Torres said quietly. Agent Torres was just one of several identities. Victoria's hand moved toward the door handle, but they were traveling too fast to jump. You're still working for him. I'm working for someone, Carmen corrected. But Victoria, that's not the same as working for David. They pulled into the deserted parking area near Pier 47. In the distance, Victoria could see a figure silhouetted against the harbor lights. Waiting. Carmen turned off the engine and faced Victoria. 3 years ago, someone hired me to get close to David's operation. Build a cover, gain his trust, document his network. Victoria felt the ground shifting again. Someone hired you to investigate David? Someone hired me to destroy him, Carmen corrected. But they needed it to look like federal law enforcement, not something else. Victoria stared at Carmen. What kind of something else? Carmen's smile was sharp. The kind of operation that doesn't officially exist. The kind that handles problems too big or too connected for normal federal agencies. Carmen pulled the flash drive from her pocket. The evidence on here isn't just about David's network. It's about who's been protecting him. And why they've decided he's outlived his usefulness. Victoria felt her understanding shift again. You're not trying to save me. You're cleaning up loose ends. I'm following orders, Carmen said. But my orders include keeping you alive long enough to testify about what David did to you. Personal testimony carries weight that financial records don't. Victoria looked at the flash drive, then at Carmen. What happens to me after I testify? Carmen was quiet for a moment. That depends on what you choose to remember about tonight. The threat was subtle but clear. Victoria's survival depended on her discretion about Carmen's real employer and their methods. What about Adrian? What about my sister? They'll be protected as long as you cooperate with the narrative we're building, Carmen said. David Brennan was brought down by federal law enforcement following a tip from his abused wife. Plain, simple. No mention of shadow operations or unofficial investigations. Victoria realized that she wasn't being rescued. He was being managed. Her revenge against David had been co-opted by people whose agenda she didn't understand. And if I don't cooperate with your narrative? Carmen checked her weapon chambered around. Then you become another victim of David's violence. Tragic but unsurprising, given his history of domestic abuse. They got out of the car and began walking toward the pier. Victoria could see David more clearly now, standing at the end of the wooden walkway like he was posing for a portrait. Still elegant, still in control, still carrying himself like a man who owned the world. But as they got closer, Victoria noticed something she'd missed before. David looked nervous. His usual confidence was strained, like someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. "Carmen," Victoria said quietly. "David doesn't know you're not really working for him, does he?" Carmen's smile was cold. "David knows exactly what I want him to know. Nothing more." They were 50 feet from David when he called out to them. "Carmen." "Right on time." "I trust Mrs. Brennan was cooperative." Carmen called back. "She gave me everything. The recording device, the location of her backup evidence, the names of everyone she's contacted." Victoria felt a chill as she realized Carmen was still playing her role perfectly. But now she understood that David was just as much a target as she was. "Excellent," David said, moving closer. "And I trust there won't be any complications with the cleanup?" Carmen was 20 feet away now, close enough that Victoria could see David's face clearly. He looked pleased but wary, like a man who sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify the threat. "No complications," Carmen said. "Just one detail you should know about." David raised an eyebrow. "What kind of detail?" Carmen stopped walking. "The detail where your protection has been withdrawn." The words echoed across the water as David's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "Carmen," he said quietly, "I think there's been some miscommunication." "No miscommunication," Carmen said, her voice carrying an authority Victoria had never heard before. "Your contract has been terminated." David gestured subtly and Victoria saw figures moving from positions in the shadows. But they weren't David's men. They were moving toward David. "What the hell is this?" David demanded, his voice losing its calculated calm. Carmen's response was professional and final. "This is what happens when you become more liability than asset." Victoria watched in stunned silence as David was surrounded by people who had apparently been watching the entire time. Not federal agents but something else. Something that moved with military precision and operated outside normal chains of command. As David was forced to his knees, Victoria heard him shouting, no longer elegant or controlled but desperate. "You can't do this. I have contracts. I have guarantees." Carmen's voice cut through his protests. "You had protection as long as you were useful. You stopped being useful when you started leaving evidence where your wife could find it." Victoria realized that her own investigation had been the catalyst for David's downfall, but not in the way she'd intended. Her evidence had simply proven that David was too careless to be trusted with sensitive operations. "Victoria," Carmen said, turning to her, "you have a choice to make." Victoria looked at David, kneeling on the pier, his empire crashing around him, his protection gone, facing consequences he'd never imagined possible. "What kind of choice?" "You can walk away from here with a new identity and a comfortable life, knowing that David will never hurt anyone again," Carmen said. "Or you can insist on traditional justice. Courts, trials, public testimony. Knowing that some very dangerous people prefer their business to remain private." Victoria understood. She could have personal justice or public justice but not both. "What happens to David if I choose private justice?" Carmen's expression was unreadable. "David disappears. His network is dismantled. His victims are compensated quietly. Justice is served, just not in a courtroom." Victoria looked at her husband, helpless and terrified, finally facing the consequences of his choices. She thought about all the people he'd hurt, all the lives he'd destroyed, all the pain he'd caused. And she realized that after 8 years of being powerless, she was being offered the ultimate power over David's fate. The choice was hers. But whatever she decided, she would have to live with the consequences of that power for the rest of her life. "I need time to think," Victoria said. Carmen nodded. "You have until sunrise. After that, the choice gets made for you." Victoria looked out over the dark water, knowing that by morning, everything would be different. The only question was what kind of justice she could live with. And what kind of person she wanted to be when this was all over. Victoria sat on a bench in the harbor park as dawn approached, watching the sky lighten over the water. Somewhere behind her, Carmen and her team were waiting for an answer that would determine not just David's fate, but the kind of person Victoria would become. 8 hours ago she'd been a woman seeking justice through the legal system. Now she was being offered something much more final, much more absolute and much more morally complicated. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The sunrise is beautiful from here. Attached was a photograph that made Victoria's breath catch. Claire Dubois, very much alive, sitting in what looked like a safe house, bandaged but smiling. Victoria immediately called the number. "Hello, Victoria." Claire's voice was warm, real, unmistakably alive. "You're really okay?" "I'm really okay. Bruised, tired of hiding, but okay." Claire paused. "Carmen told me you have a decision to make." Victoria felt tears she hadn't expected. "Claire, I thought you were dead. I thought my choices got you killed." "Your choices saved my life," Claire said firmly. "If you hadn't trusted Carmen, if you hadn't given her that recording device, David would have figured out I was still alive. Your leap of faith bought me time." Victoria wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to choose, Claire. I don't know what kind of justice is right. Can I tell you something David said to me once?" Claire asked. "He said the difference between powerful people and powerless people isn't money or connections. It's the willingness to make choices other people can't live with." Victoria felt something settle in her chest. "And what do you think?" "I think David was half right," Claire said. "Power is about making hard choices. But the difference between people like David and people like us is what we can live with afterward." Victoria understood. The question wasn't what David deserved. The question was what she could do and still recognize herself in the mirror. "Claire, if I choose traditional justice, if I insist on courts and trials, what happens to you? To Carmen? To all the evidence that involves shadow operations?" Claire was quiet for a moment. Traditional justice means some truths never come to light. Some victims never get compensation. Some networks survive because they're too complex for public trials. And if I choose Carmen's way? Then David disappears, but so does the chance for other victims to see him held publicly accountable. Justice gets served, but in darkness. Victoria realized that both choices had costs. Both choices meant some form of injustice alongside the justice. "What would you choose?" Victoria asked. "I already chose," Claire said softly. "I chose to fake my death rather than testify publicly. I chose survival over truth. I don't regret it, but I live with it." Victoria ended the call and continued watching the sunrise, thinking about power and choices and the person she wanted to be. Her phone rang again. This time it was Adrian. "Victoria, where are you? Carmen told me what happened, told me you're safe, but I need to see you." Victoria felt her heart twist. "Adrian, I don't know if safe is the right word for what I am." "What do you mean?" "I mean they're asking me to decide what happens to David. Real consequences, final consequences. And I don't know if I'm the kind of person who should have that power." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Victoria, can I tell you something I learned about you?" "What?" "You spent 3 years gathering evidence against David not because you wanted to destroy him, but because you wanted to protect other people from him. Every choice you made, even when you were afraid, was about stopping him from hurting anyone else." Victoria felt something shift in her understanding of herself. "I thought I was seeking revenge. Maybe it started that way. But revenge doesn't take 3 years of careful documentation. Revenge doesn't risk everything to protect witnesses you've never met." Adrian's voice was gentle. "What you were seeking was justice. Real justice. The kind that protects people." Victoria realized Adrian was right. Her motivation had evolved from personal revenge to something larger. Something about preventing future victims. "Adrian, if I choose traditional justice, will you stand with me through the trials? Through the publicity? Through all the ways this will change our lives?" "Victoria, I'll stand with you no matter what you choose. But I need you to know something first." "What?" "I love you. Not because you were David's victim, not because you were my client, not because you needed protection. I love you because you're the kind of person who chooses to protect strangers even when it costs you everything." Victoria felt the last piece of her decision fall into place. Adrian loved her not despite her choices but because of them. Which meant she needed to make a choice she could love herself for. She walked back toward the pier, where Carmen was waiting with barely concealed impatience. "Have you decided?" Carmen asked. "I have." Victoria looked out over the water one last time. "I choose traditional justice. Courts, trials, public testimony. All of it. Carmen's expression didn't change, but Victoria caught a flicker of something that might have been respect. You understand what that means? For all of us. It means some truths stay buried. Some operations remain classified. Some justice happens in shadows. Victoria met Carmen's eyes. But it also means David faces consequences publicly. It means other victims see that powerful people can be held accountable. It means the next woman who finds herself married to a monster knows that fighting back is possible. Carmen nodded slowly. And you can live with the costs? Victoria thought about Claire, safe but hidden. About Carmen, who would disappear back into whatever shadow organization had created her. About all the international networks that would adapt and continue because public trials moved too slowly to stop them. I can live with choosing transparency over efficiency, Victoria said. I can't live with choosing silence. Carmen reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick folder. Then you'll need these. Financial records, communication logs, witness statements. Everything admissible in court. Victoria took the folder, feeling its weight. What about the rest? The shadow operations? The unofficial justice? That's not your responsibility anymore, Carmen said. You chose your path. Others will choose theirs. Carmen turned to leave, then paused. Victoria, for what it's worth, you chose the harder path. But probably the right one. As Carmen disappeared into the morning crowd, Victoria realized she was holding not just evidence, but the beginning of a new life. A life where her choices were her own, where her voice carried power, where her story might help other women find the courage to tell theirs. 6 months later, Victoria sat at a different breakfast table in a different apartment, reading news coverage of David's sentencing. 25 years federal prison. Asset forfeiture totaling $53 million. Victims' compensation fund established. Justice. Imperfect, incomplete, but public and permanent. Adrian sat across from her, reading his own paper, his daughter's drawings magnet to the refrigerator behind him. The little girl who'd been used as leverage was now a weakened presence in their life, still unaware of how close she'd come to danger. Any regrets? Adrian asked, noticing Victoria's focus on the article. Victoria considered the question. I regret that it took me 8 years to fight back. I regret that Claire will never have a normal life again. I regret that Carmen is still out there, probably destroying other people for the greater good. But I don't regret choosing the kind of justice that happens in daylight. Victoria folded the paper and looked at Adrian. Even when it's messier and slower and less complete. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thank you for choosing courage over convenience. Others are watching. Others are learning. A friend. Victoria showed Adrian the message. Think it's from Claire? I think it's from someone who needed to see that fighting back was possible, Victoria said. And that justice doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Victoria thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, serving breakfast to a man who saw her as property. That woman had been afraid, controlled, convinced she was powerless. Now she was someone who testified in federal court. Someone who spoke at support groups for abuse survivors. Someone who had turned her pain into purpose and her experience into advocacy. The transformation hadn't been clean or simple. Victory had come with scars. Love had come with complications. Justice had come with costs. But it had come. And that was enough. Victoria finished her coffee and prepared for another day of being someone she could respect. Someone who chose transparency over secrecy, public accountability over private revenge, slow justice over swift vengeance. Someone who understood that power was not about controlling others, but about choosing who you became when the choices were hard. Someone who would never again be afraid to fight back. As Victoria left for her volunteer shift at the Women's Crisis Center, she realized that the best revenge against someone who tried to steal your voice was to spend the rest of your life using it to help others find theirs. David had taught her that she was powerless. David had been wrong. What did this story teach you about the difference between revenge and justice? About the power of choosing transparency even when secrecy might be more effective? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.